There's nothing I love more than authenticity, which is why I'm so excited about Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce, which has been on kitchen tables in Mexico since 1956. It will be available here in the U.S. for purchase later this year. In addition to livening up your food, it's Mexican-owned, it's woman-owned, and it's one of the only hot sauce brands to have 100% Mexican-sourced pepper mix. Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce will be available here in the United States to purchase on shelves later this year. Hey there, I'm Lezli Levene Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. So last week, we chatted with Dr. Katie L. Acosta about a number of topics related to anti-Blackness in Latinidad, obviously culturally. And then we briefly touched on a recent example of coded language and anti-Black law in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. But we all know that culture is simply one lens through which to view societal norms. And another lens through which to view societal norms is the law. For example, in early September, we chatted with Dr. Matthew Jacobson about whiteness and pathways to whiteness for particular European immigrant groups. I pushed back on the notion that Irish, Italians, Jewish people, and so on were not considered white simply because they were considered to be a lower class white person. I offered a portion of a Washington Post article where David Bernstein basically says, were these groups allowed to go to white-only schools, right? And you could essentially tell who was white based on who was allowed to marry. In this case, the laws reflected that the United States was institutionalizing who is white, who isn't, and what that means. More recently, during my conversation with Tyler Phillips, we touched on coded language, race-neutral language, and policies that target Black people, such as workplace and educational institutional policies around natural hair. As we know, the Crown Act was passed in California in 2019 to prevent racial-based hair discrimination. And the Crown Act, which was passed, it reflects the norms of the country where it wants to be as relates to Black people in our hair and where we're moving towards, given 7 other states have passed similar legislation. Today, we're going to explore institutionalized anti-Blackness in Latin America, whether these are implicit laws or race-targeted policies that have race-neutral language and target Black people. And we're going to do this today with someone who has all the answers. Tanya Katerí Hernández is the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham Law University School of Law, where she teaches anti-discrimination law, comparative employment discrimination, critical race theory, the science of implicit bias and the law, new pathways to social justice, and trust and wills. My goodness, you are busy. Professor Hernandez is an internationally recognized comparative race law expert and Fulbright scholar. I told you she has all the answers to the questions we're going to ask today. Her study of and work in comparative race relations and anti-discrimination law has been published in numerous university law reviews like Cornell, Harvard, NYU, UC Berkeley, Yale, and in news outlets like the New York Times, among other publications, including her books, Racial Subordination in Latin America, The Role of the State, Customary Law, and the New Civil Rights Response. Her forthcoming book is named On Latino Anti-Black Bias, Racial Innocence, and the Struggle for Equality. That was a mouthful because you are so the bomb. Hi, Tanya. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So last week, when I chatted with Katie, I told her that I smell cap when I hear people from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean say that racism is a U.S. problem and that they don't have racism in their respective countries. She mentioned that some of that mythology is wrapped in the fact that in the U.S., the court case Loving versus Virginia had to be adjudicated in order for a Black person and a white person to legally marry. I certainly hear that interracial marriage was never outlawed in Latin America, but can you discuss this mythology of national identity versus racial identity that exists in the Latin American community?
Most certainly. The first place to start, though, just as a point of, difference that I might have with a lot of the information that gets put out there regarding Latin America and its lack of racial problems, is that the absence of Jim Crow segregation, the official law mandated whites only, black only, etc., separate fountains and what have you, it makes a big difference from Latin America, but only if you think about people being subjugated solely by law. In Latin America, there was no need for the law because the people were already separated and subjugated. And so this idea that Latin America, and when I say Latin America, I just as a shortcut mean to include the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, to think that other part of the Americas is so much more enlightened because it didn't have judicially imposed and state mandated a separation, overlooks the fact that we had customary law. That is to say, law that was already in place because people were enforcing the norms and using the police force and other state funding to mandate the separation of states, the separation of spaces, the separation of schools. I could go on and on. That is to say, all the things that we think of as problematic about Jim Crow segregation in the United States, you see in Latin America's history. And so, although the emancipation of slavery wasn't immediately followed by that Jim Crow law mandated type of separation, it was because those norms were already so firmly in place. We didn't have the kind of democratic possibilities.
That's so interesting.
And so in the United States, where you have presumably a democratic society whose revolution was built on this idea of providing mobility for all, you almost need law to speak to law in order to prevent Black people from being able to rise up. Whereas in Latin America, there was none of that. So there was no need to have law speak to law. The subjugation was already in place. And so the comparisons to the United States, though, continue with this idea that, well, another thing that makes Latin America so very exceptional, apart from this sort of mythology about the absence of Jim Crow segregation, is the idea that, but we are more firmly rooted in our national identities so that there are no Black Cubans or white Cubans. We're all Cubans.
I've heard that specifically actually about Cubans.
Yeah, yes, it's very popular. Though, we might hear it more in the States coming out of a white Cuban mouth, but it is certainly a very popular kind of position to take within Latin America itself. So you'll hear it in Venezuela, you'll hear it in Peru, and what have you. And so there the idea is the uplifting of the national identity vis-a-vis the concerns about imperialism from the United States. And so that national identity is very strongly in place, and searching for points of superiority are uplifted. Right? And any issues of dissension are subjugated under this idea of we're all one country and there are no differences. And any differences that exist, those are really just about socioeconomic status. Alas, there are poor Black people, but it's not about Blackness. It's about poverty. And completely missing from that justification are the ways in which systematically the nation state and its elites have ensured that class and race converge so that the bottom is very dark, including dark-skinned people of indigenous ancestry as well.
It's so interesting to hear someone who obviously you have a lot of knowledge on law, right? And so funny that you brought up that thing about, we don't have Black Cubans and what. I literally can't tell you how many times I've heard that. You alluded to this a little bit about customary law. I'm curious about coded language or race-neutral language or policies that targeted Black people in Latin America that prevented them from access to opportunities, whether that was socially or educationally.
That's a whole bucket there. Thinking about it from even just a historic perspective, one way that racially neutral laws still targeted people of African descent post-emancipation were subjugation and control of Afro-religious ceremonies. And so the main form of organizing and of fellowship and of empowerment through religious-based organizations are thought of as witchcraft, right? So Santeria and Candomblé in Brazil are highly regulated and have to go covert because the nation state, Brazil, Cuba, many other countries in Latin America outlawed the practices, the uses of the drums in the ceremonies. Now, drums are also outlawed in the Catholic ceremonies. Well, since drums don't get used in Catholic ceremonies, well, then what does it matter?
Right.
So yes, it's neutral in that it hasn't said, oh, you Black people and the way you do religion, we're coming for you. but in the way in which it is targeting the very practices, right, that give life, right, to people who are Afro-descendant, that coding is very effective. It's still oppressing people. The way in which sort of the racial coding happens in a contemporary frame in Latin America and Spanish-speaking Caribbean, I'll give you an employment context. What is very pervasive are newspaper ads looking for employees, where the one ad will say, you got to know how to type, you got to know how to do this, or whatever the credentials are. And then it'll say, buena apariencia, good looking, right, good appearance. But that's more than just about like professional decorum, because any fool knows you go for a job interview, you're going to go dress right.
Right.
Everyone knows that's coded language for white or at least light. No dark.
Like
yes.
right now? You're saying right now?
Right now. You can search job ads and you will find them.
That is heavy.
And it's pervasive throughout Latin America. In Portuguese, it's boa aparência, but it means the same thing. We say good-looking people, but the cultures understand that language of good-looking in a job ad means light and white. So don't bother to apply. And if you should be so afflicted as to have dark skin, then sometimes these jobs ask for photographs. It's not enough to just say you're light, right? They want to see a photograph. And when they see the photograph, some places will be a little bit more open-minded, but their open-mindedness only extends to whether your features, your phenotype, look European, whether your hair texture looks European. It's so that it softens the blow of the darker skin. Right? There's a whole taxonomy in Latin American racial pathologies that are about very finely attuned assessments of people's racialization. And it includes thickness of lips, width of nose, hair texture, body type, so physicality.
Down to a science.
Down to a science. So, you know, this whole notion of, you may have also heard the idea that, in Latin America, we don't have these race problems because we don't have like white and black. We have all colors in the rainbow and people can say whatever it is they want to be. We don't like hand people into a single box. But what that is hiding behind the veil is that there are hundreds and hundreds of boxes, not to give people the freedom of racial expression, right? But instead, because we're so finely attuned that we put it under a microscope and we've got a whole variety of terms to be able to say, you're light, but you got curly hair. You're light, but you got thick lips. That is how finely attuned the language is in both Spanish and Portuguese. So that's not an indicator of sort of racial liberation. If anything, that is a sort of a perversity of how anti-Black the whole system is aligned to be.
Whew. That's super heavy. I was listening to you and just thinking about, like, I'm Jamaican, right? My family, my ancestors, what if they had gotten dropped off in Puerto Rico? And not to say that colorism does not exist in Jamaica. Let's be clear. That is not what I'm saying. You know, any place that colonialism touched, colorism is definitely there. But the way in which you're describing how meticulous every single physical characteristic is almost graded, I started feeling anxious being dark-skinned, and I don't even live there. I didn't even grow up in that culture. You know what I mean?
It's no surprise, right, that after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, that with everybody struggling, not being able to have access to power, one of the funny stories that came out of all of that were neighbors surprised by how many of their neighbors had curly, tightly coiled hair, right? Meaning, all this time, neighbors have been living side by side, thinking that their hair laid down straight and never had any kind of problems because they were all busy processing. But without any electricity, without a blow dryer, without access to the hair salon, etc.,
that is crazy.
There's a lot of work that goes into performing lightness.
I'm like totally thrown off of a loop about what I wanted to talk about today because I'm like, what? Oh my goodness. This is like, wow. Okay. All right. That really took me a minute to process that. Okay. So the performing of lightness, just even encapsulating that into a phrase is like amazing to me. But the idea that tightly coiled hair is a revelation for you, that somebody had tightly coiled hair. And is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Like, why do you care?
Because in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the rest of Latin America, there's this focus on, oh, where do you fit in the pecking order? And we look at the pecking order, not just by how much money you have. This is the mythology also that money whitens. It only does a little bit of work. Money may be able to soften how much people say to your face, but money cannot take away the disdain that people have for you based on their own perceptions about race and anti-Blackness. So much so that in Latin America and Spanish-speaking Caribbean, with the advent of civil rights movements, Black consciousness movements, it's not that the entire region is not identified with Blackness, right? You know, there are people who are unambiguously Black and know it and are happy about it. You know what I mean? So I want to make sure I'm providing a good balance. But those very same people who are like leaders of Black movements in Latin America are constantly being, if you will, policed by the white identified or the light identified or the, can't we just talk about it as like we're all part of one country and that we don't have any differences, people who happen to be lighter, if they don't have the burdens of darker phenotype. And so they don't want anyone else to talk about it as well.
Yeah. It's almost like white privilege.
It is a kind of privilege. You might even call it a mestizo privilege or a mulatto privilege. This idea that I'm a little lighter, and so I really believe in the nation state. And I really believe that we are all one and that the real problem of racism is in the North. It's in the United States. And as a matter of fact, I, as a light-skinned person, experience all kinds of racism from the North. So imperialism is always lurking in the background because being able to point to the fact, it is a fact that Latino as a category is racialized. You know, hence we can have the executive in the United States talk about bad hombres and wanting to put up walls and gates and put our children in cages.
Separate families.
So this whole idea that Latino is viewed as problematic and that it is its own racialized category in the eyes of people with bad ideas, right? Yes, that's true. But life is messy. So that coexists. It's not mutually exclusive from. It coexists with within Latino or Latinidad, different perceptions of even within Latinos who are up and who are down. I'll give you another interesting example. In studies that economists have been doing of immigrants, right? Within Latino immigrants, the one factor that is the strongest factor for the lower wages that they will collect as measured against other immigrants, right? So it's immigrant within immigrant, is their skin color. Not their English language acquisition, not their accent, not their educational level, right? None of these things are as strong within an immigrant labor population as their skin color. So that is to say, yes, there's anti-Latino bias, but it doesn't mean then that Afro-Latinos don't also get a double hit, right? So that intersection is a really vibrant one that needs to be unpacked and attended to.
Absolutely. Woo. More impolite conversation in just a moment. HBO's latest documentary, Stockton on My Mind, is the multi-layered story of millennial Mayor Michael Tubbs, whose own experience growing up in poverty and violence inspired him to create innovative change in his hometown of Stockton, California. Becoming the city's youngest and first African-American mayor, the film follows Tubbs as he defies expectations and makes efforts to reverse the fortunes of a city known as one of the poorest, most violent, and least literate in the nation. Directed by Emmy winner Mark Levene, stream it now on HBO Max. Visit hbomax.com to sign up for your 7-day free trial. I have another question. So the relationship with Haiti and the Dominican Republic has been ugly and it's been bloody. And last week, we spoke about a contemporary anti-Black law in the DR that retroactively revoked naturalized Dominican citizens of Haitian descent. I'm sure you know about this. And my family, like my current family, like my husband and children and I, we used to spend a lot of time in Johannesburg. I remember chatting with people who grew up in apartheid. And later, we went to the Apartheid Museum. And I remember being in there and thinking to myself, oh my goodness, they literally took Jim Crow and perfected it. They were like, oh, the reason that the U.S. is having a problem with their Black people is because they didn't make their Jim Crow laws airtight. They were like, U.S., I see your Jim Crow. and I raise you in apartheid. For example, like sundown towns, right? So in sundown towns, United States, I don't know if these things were by law, but it was certainly customary that they even had signs like, nigger, do not get caught in this town, whatever. Whereas, for example, in Johannesburg, I remember them telling me that you could not be in certain parts of Johannesburg if you did not have working papers. And those working papers had to be signed every 30 days by your white employer. And God help you if you are caught without your papers and without those things being current. And so I always find it really fascinating to be in a completely different country that has a completely different culture, but then find the same vestiges of European colonialism, that they're almost identical. Or it seems like, did they just take what they did and make it better and refine it and fine tune it? Can you give me an example of recent anti-discriminatory laws that were implemented in Latin America? And if possible, can you draw any parallels between those laws and any U.S. anti-discriminatory laws?
What immediately comes to mind are laws that have been legislated in and enacted in Latin America that model themselves on civil rights emancipation in the United States. Right? So modeling after civil rights movements in the United States, as opposed to the opposite.
Like the Crown Act is, right, okay.
No Crown Act just yet in Latin America. Right. Let's put it, okay.
Okay, right. No, got it. No, got that.
But what is interesting are that a lot of countries that start off with their civil rights legislation typically start off in looking at access to places of public accommodation. It's very interesting, this. So like what makes the newspapers? When people who are Afro-descendant happen to be in a multiracial group, right? So they've got friends of all different shades and they try to access a nightclub, a restaurant. They want to be there as part of fellowship. And then the darker members of the group are told, oh, no, we're already full. Or, oh, there's a separate line. Or, oh, it's a private club. There's always some reason, not race, but there's always some reason why the darker members of the group can't get in. And so in places like Peru and elsewhere, a lot of the civil rights legislation starts from places of public accommodation, interestingly enough, rather than like how we think of it in the United States with education, with mass transit. There's not very much good mass transit systematically in Latin America, so that's not thought of as a place that needs to be integrated. If anything, that's where the poor people are, who happen to be dark. And so it's already kind of open access to those who are dark skinned. But the education space isn't thought of to start off there either, though it needs it, because education in Latin America is free through university. So it's a whole other system. Let's just put it that way. So the place where it looks the most like United States are in these concerns about public accommodation, being able to get into places of recreation and venue. And so that's where there are many laws in the region that look like the Civil Rights Act of 1964's focus on public accommodations. And then it'll turn to issues of employment and discrimination. One huge thing that's very different about anti-discrimination laws in Latin America, and here it looks a little bit more like places like France and some other parts of Europe, is that the anti-discrimination law is in the criminal code. So the idea is that when you are racist, you commit a crime, and that it's the duty of the nation state to prosecute it. And that initially appealed to a lot of Black social justice movements, because the thought was the strongest statement that you could make about bad norms are that they are a crime. And so it resonates a lot. It's almost a healing to finally hear that racism is a criminal conduct. But here's the but on the other side of this, is that when you make something a crime, that means that you yourself as a victim, you don't have the control anymore to see that something gets done about it. There are pros and cons to all kinds of ways to deal with things within the legal system. I'm a lawyer, but I don't pretend that the legal system is a perfect place to solve social ills, though I don't think that's an excuse for not at least making our good faith effort to do our part as lawyers. But in putting sort of racism into a criminal code, that means it's the police that you report the crime to. And you need the police to think it's serious enough to like actually file the claim. And then you need a prosecutor. And here's another part of the problem, right? Police are often the aggressors of acts of discrimination. When you were talking about these issues within the South African context, often Latin Americans will say, oh, we never had the violence that existed in apartheid, South Africa, or in the United States with beating protesters. We don't do that in Latin America. What that completely takes off the table are the ways in which the police forces are used in very much the same way to the same purpose. In Latin America, the notion is that the police force deals with those who are bad elements, problems to society. Yeah, but that means raiding favelas, raiding low-income spaces, presumably because of issues of drugs, but more often than not to like get them off the streets for the Olympics, for example. I know all kinds of horrible forces were used to remove street children off the street who also are Black and dark. So the police violence is another kind of enforcement of anti-Blackness itself. And it's forced, right? Enforced by the police itself.
And I'm curious, some of these laws about public accommodation, what time period was that?
You see a lot of activism with regards to these anti-discrimination laws after the 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism that happened in South Africa, and it was called the Durban Conference. And in that space, lots of Black social justice movements from Latin America showed up in force and essentially embarrassed their nation's leaders, right? By vetting in the international sphere all the ways in which Blackness was viewed as problematic and subjugated by the state. And so in response to that use of the international fora, the nation states then started to get a little bit more motivated about enacting laws that could be more directly target these things. Now, the nation states have always said that, oh, well, Latin America, we don't need to do any of that because, we have our constitutions, and our constitutions affirmatively state that it is against the law to be racist.
Right.
But then there's no enacting legislation to do anything with that. It's just like an interesting piece of rhetoric, but you can't do anything with it.
Right. So, as you know, in this country, we're in a time of awakened consciousness due to the demands that Black Lives Matter are not only demanding on the state, but calling attention to all the ways that Black lives haven't mattered in this country, whether it's lack of access to capital for Black entrepreneurs or the maternal death rate of Black mothers. It's all of the ways that Black lives are not viewed as equal. Is it time for many of the Latin American countries to have their own Black Lives Matter moment? And the lens through which you view things, which is the law, what does progress look like for you?
It is no surprise, at least to me, though it was to many people in Latin America, that there were so many protesters in Latin America and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean with their placards regarding George Floyd, meaning that the concerns with Black Lives Matter felt deeply personal. And it wasn't just a sign of allegiance, though it was that, being in allyship, but it was also about trying to raise up the ways in which Black bodies in the rest of the Americas are also sort of vulnerable to police violence and all the other ills that come with systemic racism. For me, what is a path forward are conversations just like this that are happening all across Latin America, reckoning with the realities of race. It makes me think actually to an earlier question that you asked, as far as raising up these issues of interracial relationships, that there was the Levene case in the United States, but there was never a need for that in Latin America. The irony about that is that contemporary studies of interracial relationships that compare the United States and Latin America yield all kinds of revelations and insights about the ways in which sometimes interracial couples take more heat in Latin America than they do in the United States. I have a colleague named Chinyere Osuji who has a new book out where she compares interviews with interracial couples in Brazil and in Los Angeles. Right? And what she finds is that many of these Los Angeles couples feel more at ease and more welcome in with their families as well than the very same sort of Brazilian couples who are interracial in Latin America, in Brazil. These, as you would call them, impolite conversations, these are ones that have to be had in Latin America as well, because we have so many other kind of defense mechanisms and shields. So, this idea that we're all mixed and so we don't have racism, that we have lots of interracial relationships, so we don't have any kind of racial disharmony. All of these things have to kind of be broken down in order then to be real and concrete about being able to move forward.
Right. And I have a question. It may seem like a non sequitur, but it was something that you said about feeling solidarity with Black Lives Matter with many Afro Latinx folks that are outside of the United States. I think that also, in terms of what the media narrative is, will also color how people view things, particularly if you're not in the country. We did 2 episodes with HBCU Latinx students. One of the students said that he was watching, I don't know if it was Univision or Telemundo, but he's watching this with his grandmother, and he was like, it was like watching Fox News. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, from your own sort of consumption of it, is Latin media, particularly news, is it more right-leaning in terms of what images people are seeing about Black Lives Matter in these countries?
In much of Latin America, the media is controlled by white elites. And so it is no accident that the world and the United States is viewed through their eyes and their lens. The few times that you will see dark faces at all within Latin American television networks, for instance, is when they are being stereotyped as buffoons on comedy shows, when they're in soap operas as servants. The few times that they get to be on a Netflix show, like out of Colombia, Siempre Bruja, they have to be a witch. And so to give you another example that is deeply problematic about the way in which the white elites control media in Latin America, when Brazil was very activist, this is before Bolsonaro, right? Very activist about trying to propel a civil rights revolution for Afro-descendants in the nation. What was part of the toolkit were aggressive policies of affirmative action on the part of the federal government. And the students who were beneficiaries of affirmative action in the state universities and the federal universities were being tracked to see how well they were doing. And great stories of success. But you would not know that from the media accounts. It was part of this whole anti-affirmative action battle with them. Every story was a negative story. Every story was filled with all kinds of misstatements of fact because it was an agenda. It wasn't about truly reporting news or trying to have a nuanced examination of an evolving area. Not at all. Right? And in fact, it's become its own area of study now where scholars track all the news articles that come out. And in particular, how you really see this are the opinion pages and the editorial pages of the newspapers as well, where all of that anti-affirmative action stuff is shoved in there. And they try to make it seem as if that itself is news.
The Latinx community in the United States, very, very diverse. You have Trump, right? Having these targeted policies, immigration policies that are targeted at Black Caribbeans, Black Africans, just anybody Black, brown, anybody who is basically not white. But then you have this high percentage from the Latinx community that vote for Trump. I'm so confused because how many pictures have we seen of children at the border being separate? I get it if you can't answer that question, but I'm just astonished by it.
It's interesting. The Latino Justice Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund organization did a very interesting survey of people and their political attitudes. And they found a great variation, although they do voting rights. And so they're very concerned about these these issues and the election to come. And so they were trying to sort of parse out what is it that drives people to essentially vote against their interest. And certainly we see similar dynamics with low-income whites who are essentially voting against their interest, right? To vote.
People in Mississippi who have the lowest literacy rate in the country, the highest obesity rate in the country. It's you need some health care.
Right? But here's the thing. It reminds me of that old movie, The Matrix. Do you want the red pill? Do you want the blue pill?
Right.
I don't remember what colors the pills were, right? But it's about the power, the sheer power of a fantasy life. This idea that, do I vote with my direct self-interest? What's going to give me health care? What's going to help me have a better life? What's going to help me create a better world for my children? Or do I vote with where I want to be one day? In the highest tax bracket, so I don't want to be taxed. So I don't want the rich tax. Not because I'm currently rich, but because I hope one day to be rich.
It's like an aspirational vote.
It's an aspirational vote. So you're voting the position you aspire to be in. And so what you see with some Latinos, particularly those who are very white identified, right, meaning that they have the luxury, right, of being able to pass in some respects. Maybe their surname won't always let them do it, and their accent won't always let them do it. Right? But if anything, that can put people even more firmly entrenched on trying to do other performative actions of being part of whiteness and not part of a subjugated population. And so you see a huge array within the Latino community, but how to explain the Trump voters that do exist, because they're not all, right? But how to explain the very conservative voters? It's in many respects the same way we can look at how many other low-income whites also vote against their own self-interest. Right? It's a very similar dynamic that like a scientist is frustrated by and working to unsolve, right? There's like Chrissy Gear on CNN is just like, animated by trying to wake up the population to vote their own self-interest, which is better for the entire nation.
Right. Well, this has been such a rich, informative discussion. Thank you so much for joining us in conversation. I hope you had a good time. I certainly learned a lot. I know our listeners will learn a lot. I have one last question. As you know, the podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Ooh.
I've stumped the genius. I have stumped the legal genius.
I would say that I would be in Puerto Rico, in the mountains, my aunt's house, where she would be making yellow rice with the most sweet maduros, sweet plantains, perfectly fried.
Perfectly fried. They have to be perfectly fried,
They have to be perfectly fried. And a delicious fried pork chop.
Listen, it's your last night. Who cares about cholesterol?
Exactly.
That sounds amazing. Listeners, join us on Friday for our On the Yard edition, where my daughter and I will chat with two Afro-Latina HBCU students, one from Clark and the other is from Spelman, for this female-focused episode, I Too Am Latina. Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.